I love Arnor, more than my friends, more than my family, more than my girlfriend, more than myself. But Arnor just doesn't love me back the same way. Meaning, there's just never enough about it. Fortunately, even though it isn't canon, Lord of the Rings Online does have some great world building about Arnor, and specifically, Cardolan, which was released as part of the 2022 mini-expansion Before the Shadow. So in this video, I want to talk about one of my favourite stories from that expansion, about how Cardolan was ravaged by a plague of undeath, even before the kingdom fell. So as you probably know, Cardolan was one of the three successor states of Arnor. It took part in the civil wars with Arthedain and Rhudaur, but eventually Cardolan decided to bend the knee to Arthedain after its own line of kings died out. Now ruled by a prince, Cardolan fought side by side with Arthedain against Angmar and Rhudaur, but things didn't go well. In 1409, Cardolan was ravaged by invasion, and the kingdom survived as a rump state operating out of the Barrow Downs and the Old Forest. Unfortunately, the state never recovered, and in 1636, it was destroyed by the Great Plague. There's not really a great deal more information about it, but LOTRO does step up to fill some of the gaps, specifically through information that is left behind by a ranger historian named Narndir. For example, we're told that Cardolan was founded by King Torondor II in 861 of the Third Age, the youngest son of King Eärendil of Arnor. Originally an afterthought, he became a widely beloved figure, ruling from the fortress of Caranos to the north of Tharbad. Unfortunately, Torondor II seems to have met an untimely end, being killed by Eldamakil the Kinslayer, his elder brother and first king of Rhudaur. We then fast forward about 400 years, so likely after the year 1300. At this time, Cardolan is being ruled by King Artandil, who is facing an invasion led by King Malgun of Rhudaur. The name Malgun implies that Rhudaur was already in the hands of the Hillmen by this point. Malgun manages to sack Caranost, and much of the kingdom's royal family is slain, but he is unable to find King Artandil, who is away with the majority of Cardolan's army. Believing he has overextended, Malgun decides to retreat, but Artandil manages to run him down, leading to a bloody event called the Battle of Deadmount. Although Cardolan wins the day, Artandil and Malgun are both killed. After Artandil's death, the noble who managed to rally Cardolan's army and secure the victory is Lord Amondir, Lord of Tirngorthad and Keeper of the Barrows. He was offered the crown of Cardolan, but not being of the line of Elendil, he refused, and instead rode to Fornos to offer his loyalty to the King of Arthedain. This was accepted, so when King Argaleb of Arthedain rose to his crown, he claimed lordship over all of Arnor, and Amondir became the Prince of Cardolan. But Rhudaur did not accept, and this led to renewed hostilities which saw King Argaleb dead in battle in 1356. But despite this loss, Arthedain and Cardolan held firm. At this point in time, the identity and possibly even the existence of the Witch King of Angmar was completely unknown. With Rhudaur having suffered yet another defeat, the Witch King decided that he would need to resort to new strategies if he wanted to overcome the combined forces of Arthedain and Cardolan. And being a master of the dark arts, the Witch King went alone and in secret to the Barrow Downs, and he began to raise the dead by infesting corpses with spirits from the darkest pits of Angmar. Thus began the plague of undeath that would ravage Cardolan. In the beginning, the dead only prowled the underground tombs, and the people living above continued their lives as normal. But then, at the Witch King's command, they began to emerge, and clouds of fog started to form in the Barrow Downs to conceal their movements. At first, only those who strayed too close to the fog fell victim. But then the dead grew bolder, and more people began to go missing. Rather perversely, the dead seemed to target children at a higher rate than others, perhaps trying to wipe out the next generation of the men of Cardolan. It got so bad that children would go missing from their beds, and even from within the sturdy and unyielding walls of fortresses. Desperate to find a solution to this problem, Prince Amondir himself set off into the Barrows. If anyone could end this nightmare, it would be him. After all, he was the Lord of Tirngorthad, Keeper of the Barrow Downs, and those barrows were the burial tombs of his ancestors. He strode into the fog, and was never seen again. Accounts of his disappearance are few, and none saw it for themselves, but it's said that his screams could be heard echoing through the Barrow Downs for 3 whole days after he disappeared. And then there was silence, and even worse, the fog began to roll in deeper than ever. As awful as this was, Cardolan was a large place, and this undead plague was still only limited to the Barrow Downs, and not even all of it. Dol Ernil, the seat of the princes, was located in the southern Barrow Downs, and it was still safe at this time, at least until the appearance of Hithrengor, the Grey Fear. This was a man-shaped figure with cold, white eyes that was particularly fearsome, and even worse, he began to terrorize Dol Ernil. He began to hunt the princes of Cardolan. First, Prince Amonhathol disappeared while outside the fortress. He was found dead outside the door of a barrow, garbed in white, and his face shriveled as if he had aged 100 years. 2 years later, his younger brother, Thanadan, met an identical fate, but even more terrifying was the fact that he had disappeared from Dol Ernil itself. Thus, Ostechthel, the younger son of Prince Amondir, became prince. He was not about to sit around and get hunted down. To ensure the survival of his line, he sent his wife and son, Luilof and Ostir, to Fornost, and then he marched into the fog. Unlike his father, he did emerge, looking like he had aged decades and dying, but in his final words he stated that the evil had been vanquished, and that Cardolan was safe once again. We don't know what year it was exactly, but we can probably guess that it was around the late 1300s, likely very much nearing 1400 at this time. Luilof proved to be an excellent regent before Prince Ostir came to the throne, but his reign was not a long one, for in 1409 Angmar launched its great invasion of Arnor. Prince Ostir rode north with his household to defend Amon-Sul alongside King Arveleg of Arthedain, and in his absence, Cardolan should have been safe. But while defending Weathertop, Prince Ostir looked south and could see the southern sky filled with smoke, and he realised that his kingdom had been attacked. Ostir only had permission to return to Cardolan once the assault on Arthedain had been defeated. He galloped back to Dol Ernil and found a horrific sight waiting for him. The fortress had been sacked, its people piled in heaps, the defenders' heads mounted on stakes above the gate, and his mother nowhere to be found. What's worse is that when Ostir strode into the shattered keep, he found Cardolan's most dangerous enemy sitting upon the throne, Hithrengor, the Grey Fear. Whatever Prince Ostechthel had done, it had only dealt a blow to the creature, not banished him. And what made this all the more worse was who the Grey Fear was. It was Prince Amondir, or rather, it was his corpse that was possessed. With a horrible, mocking smile upon his face, the Grey Fear began to raise the dead. Prince Ostir and his small company of knights managed to fight their way out of Dol Ernil, but were pressed on all sides as they fled through the Barrow Downs. In their attempt to escape the dead, Prince Ostir's company wandered straight into an ambush of Angmarim and hillmen, and there, amid the barrows, Ostir met his end, his heart pierced by a spear. Thus ended the last prince of Cardolan, and over 1,000 years later, Merry would have a vision of his death while being held prisoner by a Barrowite. Unknown to Ostir, his mother, Luilof, had escaped the massacre at Dol Ernil. After Ostir did not return, she went north in search of him, and while she did not find him, she did find his hound, Astorin. This was confirmation of Ostir's death, for she knew that the hound would never have left his side if he was still alive. With her son's trusty hound, Luilof was determined to also try and end the Grey Fear, just as her husband and her father-in-law had tried. She was last seen heading into the Old Forest, but whatever she did, it seemed to have worked, because shortly afterwards, the mists receded, and the dead walked no more. This bought the Dunedain of Cardolan a little more time. They returned to the Barrow Downs, restored order, and a statue of Luilof was built at Dol Ernil. They survived as a rump state for another 200 years, but they did not have a happy ending. The Great Plague tore through the lands, killing most of those who remained, and many of the dead were buried in those barrows. This played into the Witch King's hand. He sent fresh spirits into the Barrow Downs, and the dead arose once more. We're told that those Dunedain who remained amassed for an assault to cleanse the barrows once again. The only clue as to their fate is a journal which is bloody and torn. So what actually happened with Luilof and the Grey Fear? Well, fortunately, the player character in LOTRO is the one who finally ties up this loose thread. On the 22nd of September 3018, the Nazgul attack the rangers stationed at Sarn Ford, successfully crossing the river at nightfall. Sometime afterwards, the Witch King heads into the Barrow Downs and begins to once again rouse the Barrowites, one of whom later manages to capture Frodo. While investigating the Barrow Downs with some rangers, the player encounters none other than Hithrengor, the Grey Fear. With the help of Halbarad, the player does manage to drive him off, but the player is also already aware of how great a threat he is at this point. So with the help of some scholars, the player manages to retrace the steps of Luilof, discovering that she had went to none other than Goldberry, the river spirit who was the wife of Tom Bombadil. She armed Luilof with some enchantments, and then Luilof went in pursuit of the Grey Fear and tracked him down to an ancient barrow called Sark Fawn, the Black Grave. You enter, discover the risen corpse of Luilof, but also the Grey Fear. Because you're the player character and therefore supremely overpowered, you defeat the Grey Fear, banishing him from Middle-earth, ending his threat forever. But you get some insights into what happened, and who the Grey Fear actually is. Based off his dialogue when you defeat him, he seems to be a Maya who served Mandos, so he was closely associated with the dead, and it explains why he had power over them. He served the Witch King, but ultimately planned on betraying him and making Cardolan his own undead kingdom. He was close, but was thwarted when Luilof hunted him down. Although she was unsuccessful in killing him, she seems to have been able to collapse the chamber before dying, therefore trapping the Grey Fear deep beneath the earth. When the Witch King returned to the north, he freed the Grey Fear, unaware that he was not exactly loyal. One final neat connection to Tolkien's lore is that Luilof was said to have been wearing a blue brooch when she left to hunt down the Grey Fear. This is confirmed to be the same blue brooch that Tom Bombadil finds in a different barrow, named Othrangoth in LOTRO, when saving the hobbits from a Barrow-wight. How the blue brooch ended up there is unknown. Goldberry guesses that Luilof might have went there before Sark Fawn, perhaps seeking something else that would aid her in her fight against the Grey Fear. So, how does this all fit into the lore? Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag. The story about King Artandil and the royal house being wiped out fighting against Rhudaur, and how this was the reason that Cardolan swore itself to Arthedain, is totally plausible. While the last prince of Cardolan isn't named, his death is also accurate, stabbed in the heart by a spear belonging to the men of Carndum. And it's probable that the blue brooch did belong to a high-ranking noblewoman of Cardolan, as Tom Bombadil met and remembers the person who wore it. But the rest is a bit over the top. The idea that Cardolan was fighting the undead before the Great Plague, while fun, isn't really that likely. If something like the Dead Rising and the actions of the Grey Fear had been occurring, it probably would have been mentioned. It also would mean that the Barrow-wights being raised after the Great Plague wasn't really a big deal, because it would have been the third time that had happened. It kind of cheapens the event. Nevertheless, the whole thing adds some interesting, spooky flavour to a part of the world that has little, and for that alone, I still enjoy it. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. If you want more non-canon stuff, whether that be simply explaining it or lore accuracy, please let me know. In fact, the most liked comment on this video will get the next non-canon video. I know that could mean a long time in the future, given that my last non-canon video on Aldegaia, another place in LOTRO, was ages ago, but I will say that after 5 years of this channel, I am gradually running out of interesting stuff to talk about, so talking about some non-canon stuff is a great way to space things out. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if the dead keep rising, then A, start burning them, and B, don't live in a damn burial ground.